Welcome. Tonight we're talking about another great Jewish personality. Of course, that's the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe Ben Maimon, known in English as Maimonides, called by his contemporaries Hanesher Hagadol, with a great eagle. And he's one of the most legendary figures in all of Jewish history, certainly, but even in non-Jewish history, in just history, one of the great figures of all time. Not only amongst the Jews, amongst the non-Jews, he's treated as a Renaissance man, someone who was exceptional in so many diverse areas of excellence, in philosophy, of course, as one of the great codifiers of halacha, of law, someone who wrote broadly on a vast array of topics, on mathematics, on astronomy, who wrote a series of books on, or treatises on medicine. But for us, certainly, he plays a very prominent role in Torah and in halacha. And his literary accomplishments and his books are actually astounding. And it's mind-boggling that someone who lived a relatively short and very chaotic life was able to accomplish such titanic achievements. Even until this day, the Rambam is very relevant because you walk into any yeshiva and you walk into any place where people studying Torah, and any Jewish bookshelf will certainly have either a book of the Rambam or books on the Rambam or both. And in yeshiva, certainly it's still studied very, very intensely until today. In fact, there are many, many books that were written on the Rambam's books, and we have on average several hundred of those such books published annually. We're going to try to get a look at his life and his accomplishments, try to get a flavor of what he represented. And just to be clear from the get-go, it's very difficult to capture such a person, such a personality, with such accomplishments in so many diverse areas, and in a short period of time. So we're going to do our best to try to give a little overview and a sketch of his life and his accomplishments. The Rambam was born in Spain, in Cordova, in the year 1135. He was a scion of a great family of rabbis that traced their heritage all the way back to King David. And he arrives into the scene at the end of what's known as the Golden Age of Spain, when the Jews living on the Muslim rule in Spain, but Muslim rule that was very tolerant and even very accepting of the Jews. And the Jews, sort of like the way we are today in America, they achieved prominence in every area of life, even though the Muslims were in control. That's going to change very fast, as we'll see, because when the Rambam was but a teenager, a violent group of what we would call today Muslim extremists, they swept across Spain and North Africa, and that prompted the Rambam, along with thousands of other Spanish Jews, to either escape or to convert or to be slaughtered. He was primarily a student of his father, or maybe initially a student of his father, and he considered himself a student of the Megash, of Rabbi Yosef ibn Megash. If you remember, we spoke about the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, who was the first one to try to codify halacha, first one of the era of Rishonim to do so. His primary student is Rabbi Yosef ibn Megash, and the Rambam considered himself a student of the Megash, even though the Megash died when the Rambam was but a young toddler. It seems likely that the Rambam considered his father, who was a direct student and disciple of the Megash, to be his teacher, and thus his teacher, his father, learned everything from his teacher, who taught it in turn to the Rambam. Thus he is, with his father as a proxy, a student of the Megash. And the Rambam, from the very earliest age, displayed fantastic ability. And one thing that everyone can agree about the Rambam, his critics and his admirers can certainly agree, the Rambam was one of the most gifted men who has ever graced this planet. It seems likely he had a photographic memory, certainly a very superior analytical mind, and the ability to sit and study for hours upon hours on end. And now we don't know much about the Rambam's early childhood, but we do know at the age of 15, the Almohads, a group of Islamic fundamentalists, they staged revolutions in Spain. And the nature of Islamic history is that, there's various different strands of the religion, and they differ primarily with the degree of literalness that they accept the Quran and how serious a role it should play in modern day life. So while earlier they were living under Muslims that were much more moderate, now there's a sweeping movement of Muslims that are very fundamentalist, and they give the Jews essentially three options. You could stay and convert to Islam, you could stay and be slaughtered, or you could flee and leave all your possessions here. Now, this is, of course, a departure from the dhimmi status that the Jews had prior, where they were given a protected, quote-unquote, status. They weren't killed, they weren't compelled to convert, but they had to live as second-class citizens. The Almohads, they develop a religious rationale for changing this tolerance for the Jews, and they uncover a teaching alleged to be from Muhammad that we're going to tolerate the Jews for 500 years. If within 500 years their Messiah doesn't come, then we no longer treat them with the dhimmi status, and we treat them like we treat everyone else, which is nation of Islam, nation of sword, pick your poison. And they gave the Jews the option. Many Jews decided to flee. The majority of them decided to flee. Some stayed and converted. Some stayed and unfortunately were killed. And the Rambam very early on is going to be confronted with the reality of Jews who nominally converted to Islam but really are secretly behaving as Jews. That, of course, is going to reach great heights, or that reality, that problem, that tension, the conflict during the Inquisition, when the Christians are going to do the same. They're going to force the Jews to convert. Many Jews are going to be closet Jews, underground Jews. The Christians are going to be very ruthless in their persecution of Jews that they suspect to be Marranos, to be secret closet Jews. And this, in this point in time, the reality that the Jews are going to be, some Jews are going to convert to Islam, but secretly still practice as Jews, and the Rambam's have to deal with it. He's have to write about it and engage with it, because it's going to be a huge problem. The Rambam and his family, they pick up and they leave their homeland that they spent a long time in Spain, and they move to North Africa, to Morocco. Now, the problem is that the Almohads actually came to Morocco as well. So they had to flee and escape. They ended up living for certain parts of the ensuing years in caves, hiding from the Muslims. But the truth is that the Almohads in Fez, in Morocco, were much more, weren't as ruthless in their pursuit of conversion or killing, and thus they had this existence where they were sort of okay, relative peace to live as Jews. During this time, the Rambam, he wrote a famous letter, or a treatise, called the Igeres Hashmad, which is the letter in response to heresy, alternatively called the Maimar Kiddush Hashem, the treatise on martyrdom. And this is a response to an unnamed scholar who wrote very ferociously against the Jews who capitulated and converted to Islam. And the Rambam, he writes with equal ferocity in return, and he says that the people that converted to Islam, but they did it only on the surface, only in the veneer, only as a facade to be safe from the Muslim cruelty and brutality, they are still considered Jews first and foremost, but also they do not need to give up their lives to do that. We know that there are three cardinal sins you got to give up your life to not transgress. One of them is idolatry, but he rules that Islam is not idolatry, and therefore you do not need to give up your life to preclude yourself, to prevent yourself from converting. But he does write in this letter which caused a lot of problems with many of the Jews who had converted to Islam but were still part of the Jewish community in this weird way, where he writes to the people that it's still preferable for someone to flee and go into exile than to convert to Islam. And it seems likely that the reason why the Rambam and his family had to leave Morocco and move initially to Israel and then to Egypt was because of the tension that his position created between him and many of the Jews in Morocco. At the end of the letter, I want to read the last few lines of the letter. He writes that we should not push away those that are desecrating Shabbos, and we shouldn't be disgusted by them. Rather, we should bring them close, and we should encourage them to do mitzvos. And that's always a tension where you have the idealists who say, we have to stick to Torah and we cannot compromise on a slight little bit. And then you have the more pragmatist people who say, well, you have to keep in mind the conditions and the circumstances that people end up in wherever they end up by and try to bring them as close as possible. Now, during the time where the Rambam and his family are hiding and are escaping and living in Morocco, the Rambam begins to write the first of his 3 monumental literary accomplishments. The Rambam wrote voluminously, but there's 3 works that tower above the rest of them, and any one of those works on its own would be enough to guarantee the Rambam a place on the Jewish Mount Rushmore. But all 3 of them together, it's really astonishing. The first one he starts writing as a teenager is a Pirush HaMishnah, commentary on Mishnah. The Mishnah is almost 1,000 years old at the time, and there has not yet been a complete commentary on all of Mishnah, and the Rambam as a teenager hiding out in caves starts to do that. Commentary on all 63 books of Mishnah. And he did a lot of innovations. The Rambam was a very innovative person. He wrote, first of all, in Arabic. And the reason why is because that's the language of the people. And the best way to be influential is not to write a book for the scholars, but to write a book for the masses of people. He wrote in Arabic, but the script that he used was actually Hebrew. This is the Rambam's innovation, to write with Hebrew letters, but the Arabic language. And we see this again throughout history, where great accomplishments, ones that really make a huge influence on masses of people, are ones that are written for the layman. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Chafetz Chaim writes the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is a book on one section of the Shulchan Aruch, which is meant for laymen. So who did he hire to edit for him? Who were the proofreaders? He got the people who weren't the scholars. And he said, you guys, I want to hire a whole bunch of you guys in order to have people like you that aren't great scholars. If you understand it, then I know I did a good job. He wrote it in Arabic, but there was a family, the Ibn Tibbon family, that were expert translators, and they would translate all the Rambam's works from Arabic to Hebrew, and there's been many subsequent translations as well. Now, additionally, the Rambam always weaves into his commentary on the Mishnah what the Talmud says in that given Mishnah and what the halacha is. So last week we talked about Rashi. Rashi is a commentator. Means Rashi is walking you in whatever we are discussing. We're learning Torah, how to read the Torah in the text. We study Talmud, let's go. May hold your hand and guide you through the page. The Rambam, he gives you much more of a broader picture, and he'll actually pull out a little bit and give you a perspective of halacha. What are the conclusions of the debate? And that, of course, is going to be his lifelong mission, to try to codify and formalize and make the halacha, to make it to reach conclusions and to reproduce that. That was something that's buried in the Talmud, and it's the work of a scholar to extract it. The Rambam extracted it and organized it on its own. Additionally, the Rambam also wrote in his commentary on the Mishnah, again as a teenager, several introductions in various points along this book, and these form many of the basic tenets of Jewish faith. So, for example, in the introduction of the Mishnah itself, he gives a wide-ranging history of oral Torah, and he gets deep into discussion the many aspects of the oral Torah and how it was developed and how it arguments, where the arguments come from, and he organizes the Mishnah and the order of all 63 books. Why is it written in this order? He goes one after another, why the order is all logical. It's not just a small introduction, it's a book on its own, but that is an introduction to all of oral Torah, essentially. Then, one of the 63 books of the Mishnah is the chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avos. That's the book on ethics and philosophy and character. And he writes another introduction known as the Shmona Prakim, the 8 chapters. It's 8 chapters where he's analyzing and clarifying the various aspects of man's soul and man's psychology and elaborating on what man's mission is in this world. Very fascinating and esoteric work. The last great introduction that he has is an introduction to the chapter that deals with eschatology, and that's the second to last chapter of the book of Sanhedrin, which is called the chapter Chelek. And it starts off, the Mishnah starts off there. In fact, in our version of the Mishnah, it's the last chapter. The Rambam is the second to last chapter. The Mishnah there starts off with Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek L'Olam Haba. All of Israel has a portion in the world to come, with the exception, it gives a list of people that lose their portion of the world to come. And the Talmud goes through 23 pages, all agadic, all philosophic, to discuss all the issues of heaven and hell and reward and punishment and Messiah and the afterlife, this world, next world. And the Rambam, in his introduction to that chapter, he gives a treatise, a very fascinating treatise on various issues that he discusses. Is, well, what's the purpose of mitzvos? We're doing mitzvos, so we get reward. What's the reward? And he brings down 5 different opinions. There's 5 opinions what the reward is. And he doesn't like any one of them. And he introduces what the real thing, what the real answer is. He says there's so much chaos and so much confusion. No one knows what they're talking about. I'll clarify it all for you. But first you have to know. And he gives an amazing parable of what life is. You know, are we just trying to get reward? And he gives the famous analogy of a kid. You want to hit the study, you give him a candy. And he gets a little older, you have to take the candy and upgrade it to an iPhone. Right? And well, is that what it's all about? We're just chasing reward? Or what about doing mitzvahs? Lishma, altruism. And then he talks about the 3 kinds of scholars and how they approach agadic portions of the Talmud. You have the people that take it literally, he says those are fools. You have the people that take it never literally, those are people who are also fools. And then finally, he says, finally after like 5,000 words, he says, let's talk about what I wanted to talk about. And he organizes what's Gan Eden, what's paradise, what's heaven and hell, what's resurrection of the dead, what's Messiah. And finally, he deals with Olam Haba. It's a very fascinating read. And the end of that introduction, and perhaps something that spurred the most controversy of this particular book, is where the Rambam organizes and presents his 13 principles of faith. He says these are bedrock principles that are necessary for any Jew to believe in. You reject one of them, you are rejecting a core element of Jewish philosophy. That's heresy, and you're disincluding yourself from the Jewish people. You're disenfranchised the Jewish people, because these core beliefs are necessary for the entirety of the nation. Of course, that spawned much controversy. Well, how could you say that one mitzvah is more important than the other mitzvah? You know, if it's all mitzvahs from God, who are we to say that one's more important than the other? And it even spawned a whole book written by one of his contemporaries called Sefer Ikrim, the Book of Principles, where the author, Rabbi Yosef Albo, he disagrees with the Rambam. He says, no, there's not 13 principles. There's only 3 principles. You got to believe in God, you got to believe in Torah, and you got to believe in reward and punishment. But the truth is, it's been pointed out that if you actually break down the Rambam's 13 principles, you'll find that these 13 principles are actually those 3 principles of the Sefer Ikrim just fleshed out. To believe in God. Well, what does it mean to believe in God? So look at the first 5 of the 13 principles of the Rambam. Well, the first one is got to believe in the existence of God. And then you have to believe in the indivisibility of God. God doesn't have any parts. God's lack of physicality. God has no body. God exists forever. Nothing can exist without God, and God is not dependent upon anything else, but everything is dependent upon Him. And lastly, the last 5 of the first module is that only God is worthy of our worship. And then the next 4, the idea of prophecy. If you don't have prophecy, you don't have Torah. Prophecy of Moses. Moses' prophecy is different than all the other prophecies of all the other prophets. Moshe is the father of all the prophets, and his prophecy is on a different level than everyone else's. The divinity of Torah. The Torah that we have today is not going to be replaced. We cannot add nor subtract from it. Again, those 4 are the second of Rabbi Yosef Albo's 3 principles. And lastly, reward and punishment, number 10 of the Rambam. God is aware of human actions. God will give reward and punishment, reward for good deeds and punishment for evil deeds. The idea of Messiah, reward and punishment, and of course, the resurrection of the dead. That spawned a lot of controversy, but regardless, history has vindicated the Rambam, and indeed, in every Jewish prayer book, we have the 13 principles canonized in both the Ani Mamin, that you'll find after Shacharis, and the Yigdal prayer before Shacharis, which is a reformalization in a poetic way of the 13 principles of the Rambam. Now, it's important to note, although the Rambam's 13 principles were controversial, no one actually questioned the legitimacy of any one of these principles. Everyone agreed that what he said was correct. They were only arguing whether assigning the term and the moniker of a principle was appropriate for these or for any in reality. Or maybe they're all principles. Maybe this is 113 principles. But either way, this really shows, the Rambam as a teenager has the gumption to tell the whole world what are the 13 principles of faith. Now, the Rambam, when he was 24, initially he moved to Israel. He didn't last there very long. And eventually he moves to Egypt, and he settles there, and he actually lives there for the duration of his life. His whole life he was dogged by the problem with living in Egypt. We know there's actually a mitzvah in the Torah to not go back to Egypt. As an example, one of the mitzvahs of a king is that they cannot have too many horses. Why not? Because horses were native to Egypt, and thus, if someone's obsessed with horses, he makes it like, that's his hobby, to collect horses. It's likely that there's going to be an affinity towards Egypt, and he may try to bring the Jews back to Egypt, and the Rambam and then that's prohibited. And the Rambam is living in Egypt. In fact, we actually found letters that the Rambam wrote, and he signed it, that I'm the Rambam, Moshe Ben Maimon HaSephardi, the Moshe son of Maimon from Sephard, from Spain, Ha'over b'chol yom b'shlosh olam, who every day is transgressing 3 prohibitions, the 3 prohibitions against living in Egypt. And very quickly, the Rambam becomes a leader of the Jewish community. He teaches Torah, and he completes his commentary on the Mishnah, and then a disaster and a tragedy that upended the Rambam's life really has, the Rambam has to recalibrate. Now, his father, it's not clear when his father died. Did he die when they were in Israel? Did he die when they arrived to Egypt? But he died around this time. The Rambam's wife died as well. He had to remarry. But his brother David, they had an agreement, him and his brother. The classic Yisachar Zevulun agreement. 2 of the sons of Jacob, one of them was a Torah scholar, one of them was the business mogul, and they made a deal. You'll study Torah, I'll do the business, and we'll split the material profits and the spiritual profits. And the Rambam had the same deal with his brother. His brother was a mogul, he was a gem dealer, and he would travel to very distant lands and trade the gems, and he was very rich. And the Rambam was the great scholar, and they made a deal, we'll split the best of both worlds. Unfortunately, the Rambam's brother, David, he was traveling to the Far East, and he was in a ship, and he had with him the whole family fortune, gems to sell in the Far East, but also he had gems on consignment for others to sell for them. And unfortunately, the ship sunk, and it took with it him, he died, and all the fortune, leaving the Rambam without a supporter, but also with his brother's family, his wife and his children, that now they don't have a breadwinner, and also all the debts owed to his brother, all that fell on the Rambam's shoulders, and he had to make a career pivot. And he had to find a way to support not only his family now, but also the family of his brother. Now the Rambam, it's evident in several places in his writing that he was conscientiously opposed to have people pay for Torah study. So you look at the Rambam in the Laws of Torah Study, he writes with very sharp words not to accept money for Torah study. Additionally, in the Mishnah, in chapters of the Fathers, where the Mishnah warns us not to take the Torah and make it a crown to be glorified or a shovel to dig with, don't use the Torah to self-promote. The Rambam goes on a diatribe against the people who say, I'm going to study Torah, and let someone else pay for it. Let someone else pay me to study Torah. So the Rambam, that was not an option. And the Rambam had to become a physician. He was a self-taught physician, but very quickly gains a fantastic reputation. He begins to practice medicine. Indeed, today we have books of the Rambam on dermatology. The Rambam was an expert in anatomy. The Rambam wrote books on pharmacology. Pretty remarkable, and his reputation grows, and before you know it, it catches the eye of the Sultan Saladin in Egypt, and he becomes the official house physician of the king and all the ministers and the robust harem of women and children that the Rambam had to take care of. The king was very fond of the Rambam. He appointed him as the official political representative of the Jewish people, the Nagid. In that capacity, the Rambam was very influential in garnering concessions for the Jewish people. And the Rambam, of course, as in every area of his life, was extremely gifted and skilled in matters of policy and diplomacy. And that position will be given on to his son after he passed. There's an amazing letter that we have where the Rambam is writing to his translator. The Rambam had a translator, Shmuel ibn Tibbon, who would translate his works. So he lived in Provence. So he writes a letter to the Rambam one day. I want to come visit you. We've been in correspondence for so long. I want to come visit you. I want to come talk to you and just to be there with you. So the Rambam tells him, listen, in response, we have a letter here. It doesn't make sense for you to come visit me. Because even if you come visit me, we won't even have 2 minutes to talk. And he gives a little bit of an insight into the hectic and demanding lifestyle, just the day-to-day, like what did he do on a given day? And it's just mind-boggling, again, like with everything in the Rambam. And I'm going to read to you what he says over here. I live in Old Cairo, in Fustat, and the king is in Egypt, and it's in Cairo, and there's about 1.5 miles distance between me and him. And every single day, early in the morning, I have to go and check up on the king and all the ministers. And if he's sick, or any one of the ministers is sick, I cannot possibly get home till very, very late. Once I finish checking up on them, I have to go and check up on all the women and the whole harem. And the Rambam, he used to never eat when he was in the official palace of the Sultan. So the whole day he's working and he's starving. And on a good day, he gets back to his house in the mid-afternoon and he's absolutely famished. And he goes to his house and he finds his lobby is absolutely swamped with Jews, with non-Jews, with important people, with non-important people, with kings, with judges, with just riffraff. Everyone's there and everyone has all their ailments. And I get off my animal, I wash my hands, I walk out to them and tell them, just calm down, I just need a few minutes to have a little snack. I have my little snack and right away I have to go and start offering diagnoses and writing prescriptions, and by the time the last person leaves, it's already nighttime, and sometimes it's even into the night, and I'm so tired and so famished that I have to actually lay down because I'm just absolutely exhausted. By the time I'm done, I can't even talk. I'm so exhausted. So the Rambam writes. And he says the bottom line is that I can't talk to another Jew and to talk Torah besides for Shabbos. Only on Shabbos. And what happens on Shabbos? Everyone, the whole community converges, and after the prayer, I give a lecture, and I give instructions for the entire community what to do the entire week. And we study until the afternoon, and then they go home. And then some of them come back until the evening prayer, and they hear a second lecture from me. And he finishes, this is my daily schedule, but you should know, I only told you a little fraction of what really happens. Just the chaos. And so he says, don't waste your time making the whole trip to me because I'm not going to have time to talk to you. And it's pretty astonishing that the Rambam, despite having such a robust schedule, was able to find any time to study Torah, much less to write books and works that literally changed the world. During his middle years, he wrote his magnum opus, and perhaps the most significant book since the Talmud, that is the Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah, it's alternatively called the Yad HaChazaka, the mighty hand, and it's a collection of 14 books that are, well, just the title, Mishnah Torah, which means a complete restatement of Torah. I'll have all of Torah, and I'll write everything that you need to know in these 14 books. This is the only book that he wrote that was written in Hebrew. And the premise of the book is that we know Moshe gave the Jewish people the written Torah, but he also gave them the oral Torah. And the written Torah, that's a framework. That's a skeletal framework for everything you need to know as a Jew and how to live as a Jew. But the actual details, well, that's all captured in the Mishnah, which is the laws, and in the Talmud. And the Rambam, in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, he gives a history of the oral Torah, and then at the end he captures it and says, well, this is my objective with the present book. I want to read this history because it's really astonishing to think about the task that he set out for himself in writing this book. And he starts off, well, first he traces back from the authors of the Talmud all the way back to Moses, the 40 generations from Rav Ashi, who wrote the Talmud, to Moses, and he gives a whole history. And he continues here with Rabbi Judah the Prince. From the time of Moshe until Rabbi Judah the Prince, no one had written any book of the oral Torah. We spoke about this when we spoke about Rabbi Judah the Prince. His role was to be the person to commit to paper a formalized, canonized version of the oral Torah. And while the oral Torah was written by individuals, just people kept notes, of course, but no one did a finalized, canonized version of it until Rabbi Judah the Prince. And why did he do it? Because of the conditions of his world. There was the Romans, they were causing tremendous persecution, and people were not stable. The Sanhedrin was under assault, and therefore he had to do it. And then we have 63 books of Mishnah that contain just the laws of the oral Torah, and continues the Rambam. The subject matter of the Talmud is the interpretation of the text of the Mishnah, and the explanation of its depths, and the matters that developed in the various courts from the times of Rabbi Judah the Prince until the writing of the Talmud. Okay, well, what do you do with this tremendous body of work? From the two Talmuds, and from the Tosefta, and from the Sifra, and Sifri, and from all the other associated contemporary works, you find halacha. Halacha is what is forbidden, what's permitted, what's clean, what's unclean, who's liable, who's exempt, what's fit for use, what's unfit for use, and tracing back today, how do we live today in the way that Moshe got from the Almighty at Sinai? How do we fulfill our obligation as Jews to live with the standards of halacha. And that's all captured in the Talmud. But in our time, continues the Rambam, severe troubles come one after another, and all are in distress. The wisdom of our sages has disappeared, and the understanding of our discerning men is hidden. Thus, the commentaries, the responses to questions, and the settled laws that the Gaonim wrote, which had once seemed clear, have in our times become hard to understand, so that only a few properly understand them. And one hardly needs to mention the Talmud itself, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, Sifra, Sifri, Toseftos, which all require a broad mind, a wise soul, and significant time before one can correctly know from them what is forbidden or permitted in all the other rules of the Torah. What the Rambam is saying is like this. To get halacha, you have to have a lot of time, and you have to be very gifted, and you have to be able to absorb all of this information. And the problem is people aren't doing it. It's only existing amongst the very select few. For this reason, finishes the Rambam, I, Moshe, the son of Rabbi Maimon, the Sephardi, found that the current situation is unbearable, and so, relying on the help of Hashem, I studied intently these works, and I sought to write what can be determined from all of these words in regard to what is forbidden and permitted, clean and unclean, and the other rules of the Torah. Everything in clear language and terse style, so that the whole oral Torah will become thoroughly known to all without bringing the problems and solutions, differences of opinion, all the disagreements. I'm going to give you just the bottom line, clear, convincing, correct statements that are according to halacha. This is so that all the rules should be accessible to the small and to the great, and in every commandment and every mitzvah and every legislation of the sages and the prophet. In short, this is this is the critical line here. So that a person should need no other work in the world with regards to the laws of Torah, but that this work will collect the entirety of the oral Torah, the positive mitzvahs, the customs, the negative laws, everything from the times of Moses up and through the Talmud, including the works of the Gaonim that came afterwards, and all that will be found inside the oral Torah, just the bottom line, the halacha. Thus, I have called the work Mishnah Torah, the complete restatement of Torah, because a person reads the written Torah, and then he reads my book, and you know everything about the oral Torah without needing to read any other book. This sheds light on the goal which he set out to accomplish, to capture all of oral Torah, all the conclusions in one systematized, organized book. An encyclopedia of halacha, of tradition, A to Z, beginning to end. And boy, did he manage to achieve his objective. The Rambam organized halacha with such precision and such perfection. Again, 14 volumes, each volume broken up into sections, each section into subsections, each subsection into numbered paragraphs and subparagraphs, system of organization that is so perfect that subsequently people would look at the order of how the Rambam, where did the Rambam put a particular law? Just where he put it, in what context, would teach you what he thought about that particular issue. With nuance, his contemporaries write about him that the Rambam wrote with the same style as the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a work that preceded him by 1,000 years, done over the course of hundreds of years, and done with the entirety of the Sanhedrin on board. And the Rambam, his contemporaries write that you have to read the Rambam the same way you read a Mishnah. You have to try to glean from the precise words and all the nuances the same way you would a Mishnah. Now, the Rambam really kick-started this whole idea. Let's take all of halacha and let's try to organize it in in a new fashion. Now, previously, the Rif, we spoke about the Rif. What the Rif did, he did something revolutionary. He did, I'll give you the conclusions of the Talmud, I'll give you the halacha, but he didn't deviate from the format of the Talmud. He still used the 63 books of the Talmud, and he just gave you a digest, conclusion of the particular Talmudic section. So you would have to still study the whole Talmud to get it. The Rambam creates a whole new format, a whole new system. It's organized on his own. He organized by himself. 14 books, starting with the book of Mada, which was the most controversial, book of knowledge, which the first section is the foundations of Torah. And then he goes on to the idolatry, laws of idolatry, and then Torah study, and then Deos, which is character or beliefs or knowledges, and lastly, the laws of repentance. Like these are the core philosophical elements of Jewish life. And then he moves on to the various other books, but it's not following any given format. Then you have the Tur. The Tur is going to be one of the Rambam's heirs to this idea. He is going to organize it as per the order of the day. He's going to start off with the morning. You wake up in the morning. What do you do in the morning? And go on from there. But it's just fascinating what he did. The Rambam is going to organize, I have over here, the Rambam wrote as a preface to his book, the Sefer HaMitzvos, the Book of Mitzvos, in which he organizes mitzvos. We know the Talmud tells us the 613 mitzvos. Well, that we know, that Talmud establishes. But what are the 13 mitzvot? The 613 mitzvot, what are they? What's a mitzvah? What's not a mitzvah? The Ram starts off with an essay giving us 14 different criteria of when a mitzvah is included in the list, when a mitzvah is not included in the list, and a list of all 613 mitzvos. And that in itself spawns so much commentary and so much analysis and so much works built upon this, both in support and also as well, he spurred those that disagreed with him. And we see the Rambam with everything that he did was so revolutionary and innovative that it was somewhat, great innovators don't always flourish in Judaism or not, they're not always recognized and accepted. We're very wary of innovators. The Rambam didn't make his life easier by choosing to not include sources. It's amazing. You have a book that is a condensed version of Talmud, that it's going to give us all the laws of Talmud, but is not going to attribute where those laws come from. It's just, no one would think of doing something like that. And the Rambam, his intention was to write a book for the layman, not for the scholars. Ironically, it became the exact opposite. It became a book for the scholars and not the layman. But his intention was to not write the sources, because the laymen don't need the sources. They just need the bottom line. But people were very disturbed by that. How do you not include sources? And they criticized him about that. And they criticized other works of the Rambam as well. We got to the Guide to the Perplexed. They took that and they thought there were problems. There were theological problems with the book. And unfortunately, tragically, it was burned by some Jewish fanatics. And in fact, there were Jews about 40 years after the Rambam died who informed against the Rambam to the Catholic Church in France. They said that the book contains slights against Christianity, and the church burned all copies of the Guide to Perplex, and just a few short years later, they took, in the very same location in Paris, where they burnt all the Rambam's works, they took 24 wagons full of Talmud, and they burnt that as well. One of the Rambam's detractors, he recognized that it's not a coincidence that the very same location that was used to burn the Rambam's works was later on used to burn the Talmud, and he was so moved by that, he actually traveled to Israel to beg forgiveness from the Rambam by his burial site, and actually wrote a book, the Sha'arei Tshuva, the Gates of Repentance, as a means of personal repentance for siding against the Rambam. And there's we see in the Rambam's own letters, how he regretted not including sources, because he writes the story here. Someone came to visit him, and he brought with him a copy of the Mishnah Torah, and he pointed to a particular law in the Book of Damages and the laws of murder, and he says to me, okay, read this law. And I read the law, says the Rambam, and he says, okay, where is this found in the Talmud? So I responded to him, says the Rambam, it's in the book of Makos or the book of Sanhedrin, where the sections that deal with laws of murder are found. So he says, well, I checked there, it's not there. And the Rambam says, okay, pull out the book. Checked it, couldn't find it either. He says, well, it's in the Jerusalem Talmud. It's not in the Jerusalem Talmud. I checked. The Rambam says, I was beside myself. I was incredulous. He says, I think maybe it's the book of Gittin. And we pulled out the book of Gittin, and I didn't find it. And I was terrified. Where did this come from? And I don't remember. And the guy left. I couldn't find the location. And then I remembered. So I sent someone after him to chase him down, and I brought him back, and I found the source of the matter in the book of Yevamos, where the book of Yevamos brings it as an aside. The Talmud, it throws in things tangentially, parenthetically, all over the Talmud, even though the section that deals with murder is found primarily in the book of Makos and Sanhedrin, but it was put in as an aside in the book of Yevamos. And the Rambam writes over here, well, if I don't remember where the place is, how is everyone else going to know where it is? And I regret I should have written an additional book that includes the book, the actual sources of every particular law. He didn't end up doing that, unfortunately. Ironically, that did spawn a lot of books as well, because the commentaries on the Rambam, the first thing they do is try to attribute where the source of the law is. And sometimes it's very fascinating because the Rambam was a very creative thinker. And sometimes he would study the Talmud with unfathomable depth. And he reached a conclusion that does not seem to jive with the conclusion that's simply read from our particular Talmud. But he doesn't give you his sources. So you're on your own. And you have to try to deconstruct what he got to and how he got there. How did the Rambam reach this? The Gemara says the opposite. What's going on? And obviously the Rambam knew this Gemara, and the Rambam still wrote this. And you're trying to get into the mind of a genius to try to figure out what did he see that, like, what am I missing? And that's why we have today about 10,000 volumes written on this particular book. Astonishing amount of scholarship, whereas the Rambam came to end all books. Again, ironically, he actually began many, many other books. The Rambam's son, Rabbi Avraham, who was his successor, he actually wrote a book that delineated all the sources. Unfortunately, we do not have that book extant, so we don't know. It would have been, who knows what the history of the study of the Rambam would have been had we actually had that. Regardless, this work was accepted by all Jews as the greatest book of the halachic code, and the Rambam himself is considered as the greatest codifier of Jewish law. Of course, he's not going to be the only one, which is going to create problems of its own. We'll have to deal with that sometime in the future in our traversing through Jewish history. Of course, the Rambam also wrote a book called the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed. He had a student back from his days in Morocco who was troubled by the problems existing between Torah and science and Torah and predominantly Greek philosophy. In that world that the Rambam lived in, the ideas of Aristotle were almost infallible. And the Rambam wrote an entire book of Jewish philosophy or Judaism overlaid on this perspective, this outlook of the world. He reconciled Aristotelian philosophy and Torah, again written in Arabic, and this, of course, was the most controversial of them all. It's interesting that today it doesn't hold as much prominence as the rest of the Rambam's works because the world has moved away from Greek or ancient Greek philosophy, and therefore it's not as pressing to deal with that question. There's new questions that arise have arisen over the generations and over the centuries. And the Rambam, in the manner of great Jewish leaders, he's always trying to address the needs of the local populace, of his constituents, and thus that was a need, and he responded to it with writing about it. The Rambam wrote many other works. I have a book over here called the arose Rambam, the letters of the Rambam. It goes through many of the Rambam's letters that he sent on general principles. One of them is called the Igeris Taimon, the letter to the Yemenite Jews. This was written in response to the leader of the Jews in Yemen, who was trying to understand. They were grappling with severe persecution on the hands of their local Islamic rulers. And also they had another thing thrown into the cauldron, and that is there was a false Messiah there as well. So the Rambam, he writes about how to tell who's the real Messiah and who's a fake Messiah, what's prophecy, what's true prophecy, how do we determine what's real, what's wrong, what's in contrasting Islam with Judaism and Christianity, and showing the supremacy, the primacy of Judaism over all of those other ones. And in that particular letter, he heavily criticizes Islam, going as far as to deem Muhammad the lunatic. At the end of his letter, he writes to the recipient, he says, well, this is what I want from you. I want you to make a copy of this, he calls it a book, and disseminate it to every community, in the big cities, in the little towns, in order to strengthen their faith and to buttress, to support their life, their steps, their footsteps. And they should read it publicly, and the individual should read it, and everyone should proliferate it. Everyone should disseminate amongst the people. But you have to be wary that it should not find its way to the hands of the local rulers, because then terrible travesties will befall us. And it says, Rambam concludes here, I wrote it, but I'm terrified, very terrified what's going to be. But the reason why I did it is because I realized that the benefit of the masses depends upon it, and I'm willing to take the risk. And he quotes the verse, the teaching that says, Shluchei mitzvah einin nizokim, those that are sent to do a mitzvah, they'll be safe. And there's no way in a mitzvah to save a whole community. And the Rambam, this particular letter had an enormous impact in the Yemenite community, and from thenceforth, the Rambam was considered to be the posek, the final word of halacha for the Yemenite community, because they viewed him as a savior from their existential threat. The Rambam also wrote many responsa, he wrote many other works. He himself lived a very chaotic and tragic life, like we mentioned. He was widowed at a young age. He had children that died in a plague. He lost his brother and financial backer to the storm at sea. He writes at the end of the commentary Mishnah, and he says, it's the very last thing he writes in the book of Utzin, all the way at the end of the Mishnah, he says, God knows that there's many laws that I wrote over here when I was traveling in caravans, and many of them I wrote when I was in a ship traveling in the Mediterranean. The Rambam, it seems like he got rid of any white space. He didn't waste time, that's for sure, and that helped him achieve these tremendous accomplishments. When he died on the 20th day of Teves in 1204, the Jews in Egypt observed 3 days of fast, 3 days of mourning. There was a fast day declared in Jerusalem. They carried him all the way to Israel. He never got to live in Israel for a significant amount of time, but he was buried there in Tiberias. On his grave, I think it gives a very apt eulogy or departing image for him. On one side it says, Hamuvchar Hamin Ha'enoshi, the choicest of the humankind. And the great Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, one of the great American Rosh Yeshivos, someone once asked him, what kind of strange statement is that? Hamuvchar Hamin Ha'enoshi doesn't appear anywhere else in any Jewish literature. Why would they write this on the Rambam's grave. And he said that the Rambam was very controversial in his life and even after he died. So some whippersnapper went to Maimonides, his grave, and wrote in it Hamin. Hamin in Hebrew means the heretic. So some guy says, he went and he defiled the grave and wrote the Hamin. So someone else came and added one word before that and one word after. Hamuvchar Hamin ha'enosha. The word min can mean either heretic or kind. So he amended it and said, Hamuvchar ha'enosha, the choicest of the humankind. That's on one side of the grave. On the other side of the grave, it says the famous words, Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam kemoshe. From Moses, until Moshe Maimonides, there was no one like the Rambam, no one like Moshe. Indeed, his influence on the Jewish people, certainly according to the people who were contemporaneous to him, approached the influence of Moshe. He was the greatest of the Rishonim, certainly on the Sephardic side, the man of the millennium, him and Rashi maybe are co-holders of that title, and he did more than anyone else. He began the effort of codifying halacha after the Talmudic era.